Okay, so I'm going to post the link to the document in the chat window, so you all have it. And so the feedback from last week's meeting was to take a step back. We were diving into the weeds a little bit, which was kind of, we wanted to do a little bit because we started out with the technical specification. But this time we want to take a step back and take a look at the use cases and see what are they and that sort of thing. So I took a stab at trying to come up with some use cases. So we'll just kind of read through these and then kind of add to them, change them, whatever we want to do. Number one, a consumer requires a manufacturer to be compliant with one or more regulation standards or frameworks. So this could be maybe the US government who purchases software, right? They are going to have attestation requirements. It could be any one of our employers when we purchase software from one of our vendors. Valid use case?
Yeah. I think that would be the core of the attestation.
I think so too, yeah. An internal or external entity audits the practices, policies, and procedures of a target organization. Subpoints, an internal audit, so an audit function within the same company being audited. An internal audit finding may be raised if non-compliance of any requirement. A report is generated comparing practices against peers and target verticals. A good example of that is BSIN. And then subpoint C, a certification may be granted as a result of the audit. So this could be SOC 2, ISO 27001, etc. Or it could be something entirely left field like UL listing, right? Underwriter laboratories, which is just kind of down here, but you need to start with this first. Are there any other, like for number 2, right? This is interesting because I use this for M&A. So I'm on an M&A team at my employer. So when we acquire a target, we go through a bunch of attestation-like things. Mostly using Excel, but it would be great to do some kind of machine readable thing with a nice little interface on top.
Yeah, I think I think the first one, and maybe it's in the second one, I think the cases that I care a lot about, I think are like software assurance, right? So I think that's, can you verify what the components are and that they are what they say they are? But then separate than that, I think the two things that I care a lot about are things like SALSA compliance evidence, right? It's one thing to test the SALSA compliance. It's another to show the evidence body behind it. And so I think that kind of bridges both of those. But often in like the contracts that my employer has, right, when we talk to a sub, we'll say like, hey, you need to show evidence of 100% unit test coverage or whatever it is, you know, all the stuff that you find in SALSA, right? And to me, that's the process part of it. And that's the part that I think is, I see in Totem moving towards, but I don't see much discussion yet is, and we've talked to like GitLab, and we've talked a little bit to GitHub about this. It's like, gee, is there an easy way to create attestations for the number of peer reviewers who have signed off on a merge request or a PR? There's that body of evidence that yes, all the rigor was put in place.
Right.
So I think it fits well in that second category you have.
Okay. Is there any other thing under number 2 that we might want to consider? An internal or external entity audits the practices, policies, and procedures of the target organization.
No, I mean, it's fairly broad.
Yep.
I think almost
Yeah.
anything
Yeah.
you put in this would fall into that.
Yeah,
Right, okay.
I think between number 1 and 2, almost all the use cases you can think of is covered. I mean, everything I can think of, for example, data transparency or yeah, model transparency, all of them gets covered either in the regulation or policies.
Yeah, yeah. Number 3, a supplier may contract with an external entity to audit the security and resiliency of software or a service. I actually do this at, well, I don't, but the product security team at my employer actually does this for every single release of the platform. We have an external vendor that we work with, and we have to ensure that we do ASBS level 2 or higher for every given release. And we have an external party actually performing all the numerous tests to make sure that that's the case. And so that's kind of the use case there. I don't know, is that specific to us? I'm sure other organizations might do that, but I don't know. It's almost like a precursor almost to, I guess, like if I am required to like do SSDF for number 1, I might want to first contract with a third party to have them validate that I can even do number 1. So it's almost, in some cases, it could actually be a precursor to that number 1 use case.
Yeah, I see that 3 is you're talking more, what would be to distinguish conducting there is the method of sharing than anything else, right? I think the first one is more like a self-imposed process on whoever that manufacturer is, versus the sharing of all that body of evidence with a third party for validation.
Right. Yeah, for number 3, it would be great to be able to get a machine readable attestation of your conformance to whatever standard that you're being measured against, right? And then if the third party, like maybe one of your customers, actually requests that evidence, you could pass that along. Number 4, and welcome, Derek. Welcome. Number 4, and I was trying to get out of my software hat and think of some other use cases that might be applicable. A manufacturer is required to obtain certification prior to the sale or distribution of something. So, UL, at least in the United States, requires pretty rigorous testing of any kind of device in a lot of cases. So I don't know if they would be necessarily a target consumer of this. They might have their own things already, but I didn't want to rule these particular types of cases out either.
So do you want to cover things like FDA certification? Is that
Theoretically, yeah, you could.
okay?
Yeah, so if you wanted to do like pre-market FDA type stuff, yeah, absolutely. Because again, there isn't a general purpose, this will go back to the objective, a general purpose machine readable attestation standard, which is essentially what we're trying to do. And so I was trying to get out of my software only mindset for a minute, but yeah, you could do FDA pre-market, you could do, I guess a lot of different things.
Makes sense.
So if I put on my consumer hat for a second, though, like I'm consuming this report, Is the goal here then that the evidence is kind of an ironclad proof that this is the case? I'm immediately jumping to fraud scenarios, like what happens if somebody says that they do this, but the evidence is faked, for example, something like that. You know, if I'm a third party agency, how do I validate this, that this is actually the case?
That's a great question. So what is the definition of an attestation? It is evidence, well, claims, evidence, and testimony. And any individual making a testimony can theoretically say whatever they want, whether it's true or not. But I think if we capture the metadata about the attester, who they are, their role, maybe timestamp and apply a digital signature, right, for that attester. You know, just like you sign documents with DocuSign or whatever, like I just did like 10 minutes ago. You know, I think there's ways to mitigate that. You're never going to be able to prevent it, I don't think.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think the knowledge about who is attesting and how do you verify their identity, be it through cryptographic measures, most likely, that timestamp of when it was done and then what is being attested to.
Right.
I think that's then, you know, I think it leads to all sorts of questions that I have, and my brain goes to like, gee, there should be let's encrypt for GA search for these types of things, and all sorts of other areas. But yeah, proving identity, I think is a fundamental problem that's going to be tough when it comes to that sharing mechanism.
Yeah.
That's what I'm wondering, if on that software side, you've got a lot of work being done right now on the software supply chain side, where they do sign that, you know, this was the build process and they put it into that external public record, right? So if they wanted to adopt this framework and then start signing things and throwing it out in some kind of an external store like that, it could be validated.
Right.
So I think that's where, like, originally we had said, you know, like we didn't want to do cryptographic signing on these types of things last week, but I'm wondering if maybe, you know, a version 2 of this or something, there might not be a cause for that type of a thing to happen downstream. So I don't know.
So I'm thinking in the context of Cyclone. So in most objects, not all, but in most objects in Cyclone, they can be independently signed. So we support envelope signing. And so you can use XML signature or JSON signature format in various parts of the document. So you could have like multiple signatures in different parts of the document. And then of course, if we link out to, again, the evidence of, you know, a particular build of how that was conducted. I think, you know, in terms of like putting all the dots together, I think that would actually work quite well, actually.
So as a client or as a customer, I want to understand 2 scenarios. One, a scenario where I just want to see an attestation from someone I trust. Like you can say self-attestation is less trustable than probably a third-party trusted neutral party trying to attest it. That is one scenario where once I see the attestation, I'm good. And the second scenario is, okay, I still want to go investigate. What would be a scenario where customer wants to go dig deep into, okay, this is they say they are SALSA compliant, but I want to see their build artifacts or artifacts about the build and testing. What would that scenario be? Is that an M&A scenario where or is it more like a third-party audit who wants to give you an attestation? In that case, they still is that the scenario we are thinking here? Because from a customer perspective,
you know, if I attest to being SALSA level 2 compliant, for example, then the receiver of that attestation can say, okay, prove it. My attestation should provide the evidence for that, right? And then where would that evidence live?
At least from our perspective, what we're looking at is the same way you look at SBOM registries, you look at signature registries. We're looking at attestation registries, where you can put in a single SHA, right, and it will pull up all the individual attestations associated with that. So that allows there to be third party to add on for that lookup without it having to be that attestation specifically called out, say in an SBOM or some other place. Like,
right. Yep. That makes a lot of sense. That way you can refer directly to that body of evidence. Now, most organizations probably won't be that transparent.
Yep.
Right. So we have to accommodate those types of use cases as well.
Mhm. So when you say accommodate, are you thinking more private attestation registries, or is it more like?
Yes, I guarantee you my employer will not do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
In most high assurance, yeah, they won't.
Yeah. I guess you can distinguish by open source versus closed source. Most of the closed source is going to not be as willing to provide all the public registry.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I think another
There
question
any-
to consider
Yeah.
is,
Go
again, I come from kind of like the totem mindset just because that's where I've been living
Yeah.
in with attestations. But to your question around compliance, right? So if you're thinking you're going to have a CycloneDX SBOM, inside of it is going to be these attestations. How does someone pass along a compliance policy with that? So as I'm going to be attesting to some compliance as part of this. So beyond that individual attestation, how do I show that compliance as as a code as policy, so I can pass that along also as part of the document? I'm not sure if I'm getting my point across.
I think so. You're saying, like, how do you pass the policy as code?
So beyond just showing the attestation, I can verify that the attestations prove I'm compliant via policy.
So that would go in your evidence, right? And the way we were, I think, thinking of that, excuse me, is that the evidence could be a URL to something, right? So if you've got something public or even private, as long as you have credentials to get to it. So a URL, or the evidence could use the attachment capabilities of CycloneDX that allows you to just to inline a document, a binary, whatever, in the document itself. So if you have maybe a written report or a document from like a third party that you want to provide as evidence, you could inline that thing in the event that it's not, publicly accessible, type of thing. So the combination of a URL and the ability to attach evidence to the attestation document itself, does that provide enough utility to communicate what the evidence is, or do we need something else?
So the scenario I'm thinking about is, again, coming from a defense contractor perspective, right, with isolated networks. And again, I'm coming from we have a project we're going to called Hopper, but the idea being that I have an SBOM, it crosses a network boundary into an isolated environment.
Yep.
How do I kind of, I think to Derek's perspective, like how do I verify that the attestations actually meet the compliance that it is attesting to? How does that body of evidence, probably policy as code, get verified to say yes, everything looks like it's in order? So I guess again, I'm going to come from an Intuitive perspective, but they have this concept of a layout where you can say like, these are all the attestations I expect to see. I'm going to verify this, cryptographically sign that, and that can be brought across as part of your deliverable. Is there some kind of concept here that should be incorporated where we have to show what the policy of code is, or there could be the need to show policy as code? So when a body of evidence and that SBOM was brought into some place, that an individual doesn't have to go search for all this stuff, right? The attestations are already in part of the CycloneDX SBOM, and then the policy that's cryptographically signed, and you only have to look at one signature.
And I guess another question is, if you are in that scenario where there was an external auditor who validated it, do you need to see all of the evidence, or do you need to know that they saw the evidence and that they attest to it? So I know that part of the reason with this, when you're working with Amazon, they don't like to share a lot of the low-level policy or a lot of the low-level procedures they do. They refuse flat out because that's their secret sauce. They won't share that, but they will gladly show their SOC 2 compliance reports and anything else, because that report literally calls out that no, an independent third party validated it. So I think that looking at some kind of a PKI support or something like that, where a third party can use an extended validation sort of say, like, we as an organization say this is valid, right? And we are an authorized certifier. That's honestly more important in a lot of ways, or at least in some scenarios, that's more important than actually seeing specific evidence examples or things like that.
Yeah, that's kind of the same thing, same mindset that I'm coming from as well.
So there are two layers, right? So one is the external, like one is the customer to the company, or in this case Amazon, let's say. So the customer to the company, you just provide the third party attestation, in which case you're giving a SOC 2 compliance as an attestation. But let's dive what I think Ian was trying to dig into was the third party versus the Amazon, where Amazon can provide machine readable policy plus proof as the second layer of list of attestations, so that the third party can just go through that list and say you're good, in which case we still need to encode policy and the proof in the attestation, which is what I understand from this, Ian. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah.
So in that case, we either our attestation has policy plus proof, or our evidence has the policy plus proof encoded in it. So we need to decide where policy as a reference stays. Should it stay as part of the attestation, where it's a list of policy plus attestation for compliance, or is it going into the evidence as a single blob?
What is the group's thought on that?
If the answer is policy should not be kept with the attestation and SBOM, then it should be something that's separate evidence.
Mm-hmm.
That's totally reasonable too. If the intent is to try to make a singular SBOM as here's everything all together, then I'd say I think getting that evidence coupled into the SBOM makes sense for that policy.
Okay.
Yeah, and again, I'm wondering from a use cases perspective, how many people are actually going to want or need or require that policy be submitted as well, or just that, you are compliant with your policy. And again, whether that's a third party attestation or not. So I could see a use case for having that low level capability to share the actual policy and evidence that you comply with it with your auditor. Right. I could absolutely see that being a use case, but that's not our goal here. Our goal is to facilitate that we have a standard, or that we meet a standard, or that we meet this thing that these third parties would want us to use. Right. It's not to facilitate the actual audit process. It's to facilitate that we have this document, that is valid, or we have this certification that is valid. Not necessarily to provide every single piece of that. Some of that would be private and internal.
Yes, but I thought it like making it machine readable all the way is as part of the goal. So I guess that is something which is good to discuss at this point. I mean, are we abstracting ourselves out at the customer layer, or is it also include third party auditor versus to the company layer?
I guess there's a difference, between, you can have something that's machine readable and not verifiable. And that's a perfectly valid use case.
Like I could have my letter of certification for SOC 2. It could be base 64 encoded and digitally signed, and technically that meets this requirement.
Yes.
I don't think it's necessarily that useful, but it does technically meet the requirement. And if that's what the business wants to see from a consuming perspective, that me selling my product, yes, I have gone through the SOC 2 process, it's really all that matters then. I don't think that, I'm not trying to push for that. I'm just saying, like, there's a scenario where we don't need to go into that much technical detail, where if that's the requirement. Versus where we were going down the road before of trying to provide a framework to describe every certification process, or every we were trying to provide a way to actually build out any standard, right? And then also show how you meet that standard, right? They're two different patterns, and maybe we want to support both use cases. You make an easy on-ramp of here's how we just do a very simple encapsulation of, the existing artifacts that exist from auditors. Like that might be an easy on-ramp for this. And then we could kind of help dissect what does it actually mean when you've got that letter of verification. So that maybe that is just an evidence piece, right? And maybe that evidence is all you really need. But then maybe you can dive into detail to understand what the actual individual line by line requirements are of that, and then supply further sub evidence. And that way the standard could be more useful. It could be used, by a Booz Allen or something who is trying to work with a large pharmaceutical to show that they are compliant with a standard, right? Then they can share the evidence back and forth with their internal systems with whoever their auditor is. The standard becomes very usable in that sense, but then they could also lop off the evidence pieces that they care about to just send that to whoever they're trying to contract with as well. That modularity might be very useful to have.
This is kind of almost similar to the whole turtles all the way down analogy, right? In the software world, right? You could have a statement that says, I'm SOC 2 compliant, here's my report, versus something that actually lists out every single requirement in SOC 2, along with all the evidence supporting that claim and compliance of all those things for SOC 2, right? You could go all the way down if you wanted to, or you could just say, here it is.
And some folks may very well want that low level of detail, right? Again,
Yes.
Target audience. If your target audience is your trusted auditing partner who's supposed to have access to your internal policy, I could absolutely then see a case for, linking out to the policy or the particular version of the policy, right? With your checksums, with your cryptographic validity to show that that was the case for this point in time, right? And then your auditor, yeah, they need that. But then anybody else doesn't need that necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
And providing machine readable at that level provide like gives a easy, lightweight verification process, and can have the heavy manual verification process in a reduced frequency given this data.
Yeah, and it could be very useful too, because if we leverage some of the ideas from Intoto, for example, where they had different predicates for the different things, you could theoretically encourage development of a predicate for SOC 2, encourage development of a predicate for these different areas, right? And then it would be a modular thing. So we could build the overall framework and then allow subject matter experts for each to help tune it a little bit, maybe. Or maybe we could develop some of the primitives, but then let whoever wants to show that they're SOC 2 again. And I'm going through that process right now with my startup. So like anybody who wants to show that they are SOC 2 compliant can start working through that, trying to build out what that predicate would look like. I'm not sure, but like to me, the modularity there seems like it could be very useful.
Yeah, we talked about modularity last week, and I think we got agreement on that. That seems to be useful. Just modular. It's also going back up to the use cases. Are there other types of use cases that we may have missed?
I would suggest that in the consulting space for number 2, there would very much be like, if this standard existed, me putting on my product development hat, I'd want my internal compliance team to have a tool that spits this out so I can preemptively show that I'm compliant and streamline audits significantly. Like that's a huge aspect of something like this.
Yeah.
You can pre-show compliance.
Right.
And that was one of the things back when I was working at PayPal. We had a very large compliance team, and they were doing 6 or 7 audits a year, right? And we did have a lot of systems in place to generate this information in a way that would streamline auditing, but it was custom every single time for every group that was doing it, right? We're trying to centralize that. If we had a standard like this, would have made everybody's lives a lot easier.
I was actually thinking along the same lines, Derek. I actually use my team at my employer. I do a lot of like BSIM, OWASP SAM type things. So I'm measuring the different behaviors of different parts of the organization and make recommendations for improvements. And then I drive those improvements forward, whether it's established parts of the BUs or whether it's an acquisition target, whatever. And so we have a BSIM app, for example, that we use, and we can measure progress over time, right? And if we have a corporate standard for, minimal viable security behaviors, for example, then I can produce those types of reports. And likewise, if we ever productize that, we're not saying we are, but if we ever were to productize that, or somebody else were to productize something like that, that would be incredibly useful.
Yeah.
Right.
And I'm going through a process again with the startup right now of CASA cloud. It's a cloud certification. And it's interesting because they actually released the configuration for ZAP. We go through that process. We do the scan using their configuration. We upload it to their system. This is Google who puts this out, by the way. So like you can go and take a look at the documentation out there. And then they just look and analyze that output, right? And then based on that output, they can infer, are you doing certain things in your API? And if so, they'll grant you access to restricted APIs, right? So like having the standard like that to be flexible where we could release individual pieces and stuff like that starts allowing you to do self-certification a little bit cleverly with easy revalidation, and maybe
Right.
that's a use case here to consider would be like, is there a way that we could, embed revalidation into this so that it could be sort of self-proving somehow? And, maybe we could do that only for certain sections, but it's an idea.
Can you phrase that? I want to capture that.
Yeah, so if you're trying to attest to, like in the software world, right, it's pretty easy to show that there was peer review on something, right? Hey, was there a pull request? Was it approved by somebody else? Is there a way where we can just kind of like run through this with all of the examples and prove, like, link out, check, was that pull request there? Yes. Right. And then you can validate the thing, not just based on the cryptographic signatures, but on that external data as well. And that's, I don't think, possible with some of these, but for others it might be.
Right.
So that actually creates a new question. So it was a good point there. The point, but the question now is, should the attestation be immutable? Should be immutable at that point of time, or can it? Because embedding revalidation just comes with an assumption that you can always mutate, and it keeps the form of attestation can change. Do we want that, or should we keep it immutable, and every time the evidence changes, then you need a completely new attestation? I mean, both has pros and cons, but I do think we should have a concrete idea why we choose one or the other.
Yeah, and just from knowing the way that the compliance world works, I think trying to introduce anything that's not immutable would be a problem.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
So,
They're not used to that idea.
Yes.
But that doesn't mean we couldn't build a back-end system that just collects all of the evidence attestations, and then you press a button and it generates a point in time immutable snapshot.
Yeah.
I do think though that we had talked about this briefly last time, but having a date range on everything, like when is this valid from, when's the start point, when's the end point,
Yes.
that's one that's absolutely got to be in there. Because yes, it is a point in time attestation, but usually you're going to be doing audits every year, every 6 months, and you kind of want that to be, you want that level of flexibility in this. Because it isn't just that it's capturing, well, maybe it is just that it's capturing your current point in time, but I'd like to be able to say that, from last year to present, this was the case.
Right. No, that's good. I completely forgot about that from last week.
I guess the question that kind of goes back to what I was asking about policy, though, right? Is that I don't see it necessarily as a quality of attestations. I see that more as a policy issue. Maybe I'm missing the nuance here.
But when you say policy, which policy are you talking about? Talking about like a company's internal policy, and we want to bundle up, like, here's my company's software development policy, right? And I believe that this is following the normal SDLC that's out there, or that we're attesting to, but now I need to bundle that whole policy up and publish that out. Is that something I normally wouldn't do? Or are you talking the policy that we're saying we are agreeing to here, that we're compliant with? Like, which policy do you mean?
Sure. I think so again, I'm coming from a very like defense contractor perspective, and I'm dealing with like authorizing officials, right? So an authorizing official is is going to want to lay down a policy, cryptographically sign it. And as long as I meet that policy, I can do a continuous delivery of build artifacts from one environment to the next.
Okay,
And
so you're talking like letter of authorization, that kind of thing.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's one where whoever is consuming it says, this is what I want you to agree to. So, right, as I was thinking from the other way of like, well, if I'm trying to show that I'm following my own internal policy so somebody will buy it, right? So that's why I wanted that clarification. Because yeah, that's an interesting idea, because that almost goes back to like that idea of predicates and saying like, hey, I want you to at least do these things, right? And then I will gladly consume your stuff as long as you can show me that you're doing that. That's a really
Correct.
interesting idea. Like that whole thing around predicates or sub schemas or something, that is very powerful.
Let's capture that. I mean, I kind of see that as its own use case. And I think we can achieve that here. I don't think it's hard. I think we just need to design with that in mind. So
As long as we're capturing the right information to be able to make that decision.
right. So oops. So help me capture that use case again, Ian.
I think it's kind of like the consumer defines their own policy. And you want to validate that policy with attestations.
Validate maybe incoming artifacts conform to that policy.
Yeah,
Something like
that's
that.
a good way to put it.
What's that?
So validate incoming artifacts conformance to that policy. So the idea is that like this particular entity can define the policy that they want,
Yep.
and then that standard then whoever wants that business or whoever wants to be able to push their system to there, they need to certify to that standard. So we become a little bit of a configurable middle language that
Right.
allows the two to come to agreement that yes, you can run here.
And from your, okay, I see where you're going with this again. So from your air-gapped environment perspective, you'd have all the data that you'd need, right, in the bill of attestation in your air-gapped environment, right? Okay,
Correct.
I think I follow you.
So in this case, like, I may have a diode, I have some sort of one-way connectivity from one network to the next.
Right.
So once it gets through the door and it's kind of in that validation period, how do I validate that the attestations are correct? How do I validate the attestations that I expect to have there actually exist? Like, how do I enforce that policy? And if anything doesn't match, then as a security personnel, the authorizing official, I can reject the transfer.
Right.
Yeah, but you could, as that entity, you could publish your policy out of that network, and then
Correct.
people know what you would require to allow something to enter that particular network. And then within that network, as part of setting up that transaction, you could say, okay, we agree to these cryptographic signers to, attest that this was done this way. You can validate the information inside. And then, or you can validate the information outside and then allow it through that ingress channel as part of that.
So
They're looking to do a lot of that kind of thing with in toto for Kubernetes. Basically, like an admission, it's literally the concept of the admissions controller, right?
Mm-hmm.
And saying like, no, you need to go through whatever I say the policy is before I will let your code run in my cluster. It's the same idea.
Mm-hmm.
It's just like publishing what that policy is.
Got it.
So
And the policy could be anything too, right? I mean, quite literally. Okay.
Yeah, and unfortunately for us, at least, it's really on the whim of whoever that authorizing official is. It could be totally arbitrary based on who that one person is.
Yeah, but it's a nice thing to force them to codify it, right? Because then
exactly
you
right.
can't be at the whim. It's either you are allowed or you're not according to the policy, and either the policy is not good enough or it's accurate.
Right. Okay. I'm glad we captured that use case. I think that's really interesting.
So this kind of segues nicely into like defining attestation in a generic manner. So attestation in general is a conformance of a number of artifacts with a certain policy. So it can be at the consumer level, it can be at the at almost at your internal infrastructure level where we were talking about Kubernetes. So you can use it at different layers, which, yeah, so the point 5.a, I think, can be applied to like different levels. One can be internal, one can be at the third party, one can be at the consumer. It's just that providing the relevant artifact with the consumer's policy should be able to generate your attestation.
Yeah.
I will say the more that I'm thinking about this, the more I think that a lot of the ideas in the in-toto framework could be pulled right into this. There's a lot of pieces there. I don't have a good understanding of the Sky one that was mentioned last time. I'm still getting familiar with that, but just understanding the way that they do the wrapping, the way they do the custom predicate definition and stuff, a lot of those pieces I think would be very applicable to this. Based on what we're talking about now. I do think there's probably a pretty solid fit. And then it becomes a little bit more of a conversation around what predicates are we talking about building here? Or what guidelines are we talking about there? I think that starting to think through some of that might be a good way to go in this, because the other format is very flexible intentionally to be able to do things like this. I kind of want to play with that a little bit, maybe on the side, and see, like, would it make sense? Would this work for, something like SOC 2, something like CASA, one of those, just kind of like guinea pig it and see, what would we be looking at there?
Yeah, I think the lack of documentation and whatnot is going to be an issue. Because I tried to look for a lot of that documentation for their attestation framework that they were saying in the last meeting. I couldn't find any of it.
Yeah, I'm happy
to
ping you some links because I did manage to find some of it. And some of it's still in the works. Like, it looks like the Sky one is still in the works a bit. This seems to be much lower level. Like, it's for things like, hey, what's your C compiler settings? But if we abstract back a little bit from that and say, well, I'm not really concerned about the C compiler settings, but I am concerned about, maybe my production controls, for example. Like, what am I using to control access to production? Do I have role-based access controls? Yes or no? I mean, that's a binary, right? And so theoretically, you could put some of that in and then go into details in it. Like, I think there is some capability here to take the ideas here and pull them out, because it seems to be pretty generic around, like, hey, this is the subject attribute, right? And we're saying the attribute is this. Then there's some other conditions or some other evidence that's within there, and we're also giving you the digests of that stuff and the links to it. It seems to be fairly flexible. And if this isn't a good fit by itself, then there's some of the other predicate specs that might be, or we build our own from scratch. Like, operating within that framework, though, automatically gives us a little bit more interoperability, I think, or at least maybe that's not true, because it is very fledgling too. So maybe that's not accurate, but
yeah,
there's ideas here that
the one, yeah, I think there's a few concepts in here that I actually missed, because compliance isn't necessarily a binary thing. So you triggered me when you said binary. Partial compliance is a reality.
Maybe that's what we need to concentrate on when we're doing this, is showing, like, hey, yeah, you're from your example before, you're at that 0.8. This isn't a 1 or a 0, you're at a 0.8. But in some ways that is just, a field within the predicate. Like, we could clearly indicate that.
Right.
And maybe that's a very good case why Sky doesn't work for us, because it doesn't have that by default. And again, I don't know if it does or doesn't, but very preliminarily, it didn't look like it did. But yeah, I think there's ideas there that we could pull out.
We've got this. This has been a fantastic conversation. It's great having people smarter than me on the phone. What do we want to concentrate on for next time we meet? What should be our objectives for next time?
I guess let's decide on if in toto would be a good envelope format, right? I think for the past 3 meetings, we have been kind of having a discussion on whether in toto is an envelope format, which can be extensible through their predicate framework. I think once we decide that, then we can have a concrete next steps on whether we are defining our own envelope format or just like, are we reusing envelope format and just defining predicates? Would that be a good next step? Because I believe that's been the discussion. So whenever we get to the fine details, we always get back to the in toto. So if we can decide on that and move forward, then we can either define our own envelope format or just reuse theirs.
And in toto actually adopted a envelope format that was kind of broken out as a separate standard. So
Oh, really?
yeah, there was something about that last year, back when I was in the compliance space working on that type of thing. I found out that they did like adopt an overall envelope format that was compliant with something else. I think it was DSSE, it was called. That's the outermost layer of the attestation format. Now, I don't know how much DSSE was used or not, but that was kind of the generic wrapping envelope that they were using. And I'm throwing a bunch of links over here in the side to share where this is all coming from. But it's very, very straightforward. It's like there's the payload type, and signatures as an array. It's about as generic as you can get. And honestly, that's kind of the beauty of the flexibility of the framework, is that you're basically saying that whatever my payload is, I'm going to define, or my payload type, that's the schema, that's the predicate, right? And then you can kind of do whatever you want with it underneath there. And then you have to basically have your producers and your consumers agreeing on what that predicate is, right? That's where the strength comes in, and you can use it, in-house for very simple, lightweight things, or you could theoretically, define a predicate for SOC 2 or whatever else you're looking for at that point.
So let me ask you a question, because this actually might influence where we're going. Does in toto support serialization to XML?
I don't know if it does natively or not, but it's just a JSON object. So theoretically, you can, deserialize it or serialize it to whichever formats you want. I think natively it's just JSON. And there was some preliminary work at one point around using JSON schemas for validation. So that may be, important here. It may not be. I am not an expert on in toto. I would qualify it as an extreme hobbyist because I really like the ideas in it. But the guy who wrote quite a bit of the spec was in the meeting last time, so he did want to come back in and have more conversations. He'd be able to weigh in a lot more detail on it.
Okay.
But yeah, a couple of the links in here, it would include the main spec as well. So in that, the one that I just posted in is the main spec.
Yeah, I mean, I work pretty closely with a lot of those folks in the Toto community, and yeah, I mean, right now they're only supporting JSON. But that said, though, I think they are eager to show usage here, and so I think there's interest there, right? And for full transparency, I've worked with some of the Toto folks on what they are calling SBOM it, which is wrapping SBOMs within Toto attestations, which is very much aligned to this. That's why I want to sit here and kind of understand what's going on. So I don't know if you want those folks in the meeting, right? It's kind of hard to have an impartial discussion when you have some of the project maintainers on it. But I think we're more than, I'm happy to make sure that representation is here if you so choose.
Okay.
Aditya is pretty non-partial. Some of the other guys can be pretty heated.
Yeah. Let's I don't know. Let's try to do the research. Who know, I guess, I don't know a lot about in toto, so I'm probably the least qualified. I know what it doesn't do in my employer's environment, but I don't necessarily know what it does do, which is an entirely different question.
Yeah, I think it's more an argument of what it can do versus what certain
Right.
implementations of it do, because it really
Right.
is very flexible, but certain people want certain things out of it and will implement it a certain way, which can limit or empower or any number of things, I would say.
I'd say that's where you see this movement, like as sticking to the attestation framework, is really around showing that interoperability, consolidating this large swath of what people are doing down to like some known standard predicates, so then that interoperability can exist. Because right now people are doing all sorts of wild things with it.
Right. Okay, let's I don't know, let's research that over the next week. I'm also going to create, so if we go down the route of looking at, can we reuse this thing? Can we reuse it as an envelope? We also need to simultaneously go down the route of, let's see what this looks like as a standalone thing. Then we can meet up, I guess, next week to see where we're at. Right, let's look at the use cases, put everything back to the use cases. Can we achieve what we actually want to do? Who wants to volunteer for looking at Toto and looking and seeing, do these, can we use it for what we want to do?
I'm happy to, but I would say I am not an impartial person. I've been
Okay.
getting involved in a dodo. So
I can
Okay.
take that.
I am a fanboy, like freely admitted fanboy of that framework. Although I'll throw out there, I'm happy to get on a call with somebody and walk through it. It might be better if more than one person did that. And I do have a passing familiarity, but I do try to remain impartial on things. So I'm happy to get on a call with somebody and kind of review possible scenarios for that.
So let me set up a call with you. How about like, and we can walk through for a few.
Okay.
Fun.
Yeah, absolutely happy to do that.
Is everybody here on the Slack channel?
Yeah, I am.
I believe
Awesome.
so. Okay.
All right. Very good. I know we're at time, so thank you so much for today's discussion. This is phenomenal. I think we're making some progress, so this is great. Yeah, looking forward to diving into the next steps for next week. Cheers. Have a great rest of your day.
See you, everyone.
Bye. Bye.
Take care.